Pictures tell stories. Or to be more accurate, viewers find stories within the pictures they see. One of Vincent van Gogh's most famous paintings, The Starry Night, is a swirl of stars. The cypress tree in the foreground is sometimes thought to be the tree of death from classical mythology. And the brightest star overhead might be one from Joseph's dream in the book of Genesis. Van Gogh's swirling scene has also inspired writers to link his painting to the human imagination. For one writer, the Starry Night might become an astral map of a foreign land, or for another writer, a portal to another dimension. One of my favorite examples is a children's book called Katie and the Starry Night, in which a girl named Katie visits a gallery with her grandma and finds herself enraptured with Van Gogh's masterpiece. "It looks magical," Katie says, "like a dream." When the girl peers a little more closely, it seems as if the stars are moving. And it's at this very moment that Grandma decides to take a convenient nap on a museum bench. So Katie climbs through the picture frame and up into Van Gogh's whirling sky. She's ready for adventure. Yet pictures don't always lead to magic or dreams or imaginative stories. Sometimes when you look at an image, it evokes stories from your own life experience. Take the work of Andreas Gursky. His enormous photographs, such as the one called 99 Cent, which shows the enormous, vibrant interior of the aisles of a supermarket, dwarf the viewer. His photos make you feel anonymous and small. The 99 Cent photograph brings to mind our own scenes of shopping and consumer desire. Each of us has entered a big box store and been dazzled by the endless rows of bright and alluring goods that beckon us to buy, buy, buy. And it's our own distinctive backgrounds, whether we're from the middle or the working class, from a developing country or a developed one, whether we're a teenager or an octogenarian, that determine the stories we see in Gursky's supermarket scene. We bring the baggage of our own lives to what we see through our eyes. In whatever we observe, we often see ourselves. So if you want to create a visual essay, meaning an essay that incorporates pictures, it's important to consider the imaginative possibilities contained in images. A picture can open up ways to extend, comment upon, and even contradict ideas within an essay. A picture can also start interesting conversations between words and images. And two, a picture can provide your readers with surprising interpretations and deepen and expand your essay's significance. So when you bring images into your writing, it's vital for you to ignite their imaginations and draw upon their past experiences. At the same time, it's also crucial to realize that to see only your own fantasies or background within a picture is to limit its potential. When we think about pictures as we gaze at them, in a sense, pictures think about us as they gaze back. All paintings, drawings, photographs, and digital images contain the notions and opinions of the artists who made them. And even more importantly, these pictures contain the notions and opinions embedded in the artistry of the images themselves. The award-winning British novelist Jeanette Winterson wrote a series of essays called Art Objects, or Art Objects, in which she grapples with the complex dynamics between a picture and its viewer. She especially speaks to the dangers of looking at images in a limited or limiting way. Winterson's collection begins with an essay, also called Art Objects or Art Objects, in which she tells the story of a certain painting she came across while visiting continental Europe. She writes, "I was in Amsterdam one snowy Christmas when the weather had turned the canals into oblongs of ice. I was wandering happy, alone, when I passed a little gallery and in the moment of passing saw a painting that had more power to stop me than I had power to walk on. Quality of the draughtsmanship, the brush strokes in thin oils, had a Renaissance beauty. But the fearful and compelling thing about the picture was its modernity. Here was a figure without a context, in its own context, a haunted woman in blue robes pulling a huge moon face through a subterranean waterway. What was I to do? Standing hesitant, my heart flooded away. I had intended to leave Amsterdam the next day. I changed my plans and, sleeping fitfully, rising early, queued to get into the Rijksmuseum, into the Van Gogh Museum, spending every afternoon at any private galleries I could find. My turmoil of mind was such that I could only find a kind of peace by attempting to determine the size of the problem. My problem. The paintings were perfectly at ease. I had fallen in love, and I had no language. I was dog-dumb. The typical response of, "This painting has nothing to say to me," had become, "I have nothing to say to this painting," and I desperately wanted to speak. Long looking at paintings is equivalent to being dropped into a foreign city where gradually, out of desire and despair, a few key words, then a little syntax, makes a clearing in the silence. Art, all art, not just painting, is a foreign city, and we deceive ourselves when we think it's familiar. No one is surprised to find that a foreign city follows its own customs and speaks its own language. We have to recognize that the language of art, all art, is not our mother tongue. The rest of Winterson's essay tries to explain how we might learn the language of pictures, not the written or spoken language we use to describe or to interpret them, but instead the visual language that the pictures themselves speak. As Winterson puts it, it is connection that we seek, connection to the past, to one another, and to the physical world. A picture can remind me of feelings, thinkings that I did not even know I had forgot. Of course, Winterson uses this painting of a woman dragging a moon face through water as a means of launching her entire essay. By starting with a specific image and then generalizing more broadly, Winterson is attempting to revise, as well as to rethink, the relationship between an art object and its audience. So one way to write a visual essay is to start with a picture that captivates you in some way, and then build a piece of writing around it. Your essay would draw upon the picture itself as a stimulus for probing your thoughts and feelings about what this image might be saying to you, as well as what it might say to your readers. Winterson herself offers an exercise for how writers might pay better attention to pictures. But I do have to warn you, it's not an easy exercise. First, Winterson says we must detach ourselves from the ingrained and cliched ways of viewing that we've been taught our whole lives as consumers of popular culture. The pop culture perspective tends to trivialize pictures, reducing them to surface instead of substance. We're all deluged by visual reproductions, from TV shows and movies to commercials and Google images to Facebook memes and corporate swag. And we've been taught to react to these images in simplistic ways with, "I like it" or "I don't like it," responses that are programmed by advertisers, web designers, and film promoters. Winterson insists that as writers, we cannot be passive when looking at pictures. The question, "Do I like this?" should be nothing more than the beginning of our thoughts about an image, and not our final judgment. She explains that an examination of our own feelings must give way to an examination of the piece of work. True art, when it happens to us, challenges the I that we are. So how does that happen exactly? How might we write a piece about a picture that challenges each of us, the I that we are, in deep and demanding ways? Winterson says we must agree to spend at least an hour with whatever picture we hope to understand. She writes, "Supposing we made a pact with a painting or a photograph or a drawing and agreed to sit down and look at it on our own with no distractions for 1 whole hour. The picture should be an original, not a reproduction, and we should start with the advantage of liking it, even if only a little. What would we find?" Winterson believes we would find a great deal. For one, we'd find increasing discomfort the longer we look. Ordinary life passes in a near blur, Winterson says. If we go to the theater or the cinema, the images before us change constantly. Our loved ones are so well known to us that there is no need to look at them. And one of the gentle jokes of married life is that we do not. Nevertheless, here is a picture, and we have agreed to look at it for an hour. And we find that we are not very good at looking. Winterson goes on to argue that in the light of our increasing discomfort, we'll get distracted. Our mind will wander to the football game, to sex, to what's for dinner, to how many pounds we'd like to lose, to when we have to pick up the dry cleaning, and to why we aren't writing something already. For anyone who takes yoga or who meditates on a regular basis, this kind of distraction will sound familiar. It's the monkey mind that takes us away from the eternal now of our bodies and our breath. But Winterson believes that if we continue to look, if we truly focus our whole attention on this picture for an entire hour, then we'll start to move away from distraction and discover increasing invention. We'll start to ask ourselves detailed questions about the image. Is it a portrait or a landscape? Is it abstract or realistic? What colors define it? Where are the shadows or the highlights? What is dim or obscure? And what is crystal clear? What is the picture's perspective? Is it a close-up, a panorama, or an image that's somewhere in between? And what story does the picture tell? Are there characters or a setting? What about actions or a plot? And what emotions does the story potentially evoke? For Winterson, these questions are a good start. They demand that we meet the picture's intensity of representation with our own intensity of observation. And yet, even as we start to move from distraction to invention, we will also become irritated. We'll ask ourselves, why doesn't the picture do something? Or, why should I admire this picture? Quite clearly, it doesn't admire me. And that is the great difficulty of trying to figure out the foreign language of pictures. As Winterson says, admire me is the subtext of so much of our looking. We demand that art should reflect the reality of our lives, our own obsessions, needs, and vanities. But the truth of a picture, of any picture, is its universal truth, not the mundane facts of a certain Joe or Jane who might want to see themselves reflected in it. So we writers need to push ourselves beyond our selfish, small desires to see our own pursuits and passions, our needs and wants, fears and fantasies within the paintings, photographs, and drawings that we gaze at. As Winterson puts it, when the thick curtain of protection is taken away, the protection of prejudice, protection of authority, protection of trivia, even the most familiar of pictures can begin to work its power. So how might we push past this thick protective curtain of personal prejudice, authority, and trivia, especially when we want to write visual essays? After you spend that first hour with your picture, do it again, and on a different day. And then again. And yeah, again. Eventually, with repeated viewings, you'll start to learn your picture's alphabet. Then you'll start to discern your picture's dialect. And finally, you'll see in the picture the result of a collaboration or a connection between that picture and you, and not just a representation that you've remade in your own image. Okay, so one way to think visually and to write a visual essay is to have your focus be on a single picture and to write around what you discover about that picture. Of course, you'll also write about what you've discovered about yourself and the world that that picture seeks to engage. Yet there are other interesting ways that essayists bring images into their writing, and I'd like to touch on a few examples. The other visual forms that intrigue me are illustrated essays and what I'm going to call second sight essays. There's a strong tradition of writers who bring together words and pictures to produce visual essays and memoirs. The most obvious examples are pieces in which pictures serve the story that the writer is trying to tell about life, society, or habits of the mind. These are illustrated essays. Illustrated essays have a relationship to images that have been handed down from the illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period. These include children's picture books, illustrated novels, and some comics. The images within these kinds of essays are entirely illustrative. There isn't a tension between the pictures and the words. Instead, the two mediums work together to produce a common meaning. This approach includes essay collections and memoirs with chapter heading illustrations, pictures that signal to a reader what each chapter of the book is about. One example I really like is a book of essays by Barbara Kingsolver called Small Wonder. Among the pieces is one called Lily's Chickens, which begins with Kingsolver talking about how her daughter Lily has a particular love of chickens and enjoys gathering their eggs. "My daughter is in love," she writes. "She's only 5 years old, but this is real. Her beau is shorter than she is by a wide margin, and she couldn't care less. He has dark eyes, a loud voice, and a tendency to crow. He also has 5 girlfriends, but Lily loves them all. Mr. Doodle, Jess, Bess, Mrs. Zebra, Pixie, and Kiwi. They're chickens." This is a story about Lily and how she swoons over Mr. Doodle. And it's a means for Kingsolver to launch a larger discussion about the mass-produced food that most Americans eat relative to the local, seasonal, and small farm diet that Kingsolver and her family have adopted. Kingsolver is keenly interested in the costs, both physical and environmental, of consuming foods that are grown, harvested, and slaughtered through factory farming. She writes that Americans have a taste for food that's been seeded, fertilized, harvested, processed, and packaged in grossly energy-expensive ways and then shipped, often refrigerated, for so many miles it might as well be green cheese from the moon. And while most Americans are entangled in a car dependency not of our own making, nobody has to eat foods out of season from Rio de Janeiro. Okay. So at the very beginning of this essay, as this is true for each piece of writing in Kingsolver's collection, there's a drawing by an artist named Paul Marocha. The illustration is of a hand cradling an egg in its palm. Just before a reader sees this illustration, Kingsolver writes that Lily likes to sit on an overturned bucket and sing to the chickens in the afternoons. She has them eating out of her hand. And then, just after the picture, the essay reads, "It began with coveting our neighbor's chickens. Lily would volunteer to collect the eggs." And so, Paul Marocha's drawing makes both clear and concrete the mental image of Lily scooping up an egg in her hand, yet the picture also provides an interesting reversal. For just as the chickens literally and also metaphorically eat out of Lily's hand, she in turn eats the eggs that she gathers in that same hand. So Marocha's picture reinforces Kingsolver's words, eating out of her own hand. And since the drawing in this book are realistic, they're highly detailed black and white sketches, this style of illustration echoes 19th century woodcuts. They bring to mind old-fashioned children's books, such as the famous illustrations by Garth Williams for the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. In other words, the style of Marocha's sketches evokes a one-to-one correlation between word and image that typifies essays and memoirs that are illustrated in a traditional way. So if you want to create visual essays that reinforce your words through pictures, then using an illustrative approach makes sense. Other examples of this approach include Kingsolver's memoir about living almost entirely off the industrial food grid for a year, called Animal Vegetable Miracle, and the illustrated essay collections Philadelphia on the Fly, Tales of an Urban Angler by Ron Swegman, as well as Look Both Ways, illustrated essays on the intersections of life and design by Debbie Millman. So reinforcing words through images is a straightforward yet highly engaging way to enhance your writing. and to bring even more meaning to your essays. But if your aim is to call into question the assumed power of images, or to create a kind of tension across words and pictures, maybe a conversation or even an argument, then you might wish to try another kind of approach. I call this kind of visual essay a second sight essay. In second sight essays, writers want readers not just to look more closely at pictures, but to look at them again, to re-see them, to view them anew. More often than not, second sight essay writers are writing about what they believe pictures can and cannot contain. They want to think about whether pictures have the ability to capture human memory or history, whether pictures have an inherent morality or should be held to an ethical standard, or whether the artistry of a picture is more important than its subject matter. So writers who craft second sight essays are often amateur philosophers, cultural critics, or intellectuals. They are intrigued by the doubleness of all imagery, how it represents a person, a place, or a thing, but how, too, it can never actually be that person, that place, or that thing. For all pictures, regardless of the medium, are only substitutes for the real, the actual, and the now. So second sight essays engage dialogues across language and image to create an interdependent reading experience. It is a medium in which the pictures convey the writer's ideas as much as their carefully chosen words. One of my favorite examples is Roland Barthes' Reflections on Photography, Camera Lucida. This is a series of short but interlinked essays that contemplate the elusive power of a photograph to create and to shape reality. Barthes embeds certain photographs in some of his essays, allowing a reader to see them. In others, he doesn't. And the space in his essays left by the absence of those photographs is as important as what is taken up by the pictures that he does provide. In one of these essays, Barthes describes a photograph from 1865 of a young man who is about to be hanged, and he includes the picture alongside of his reflections. The condemned man at the center of the frame is Louis Payne, a man who tried to assassinate the U.S. Secretary of State. The photographer, Alexander Garner, took the portrait while Payne was in his cell, awaiting execution. Barthes writes that the photograph is handsome, as is the boy. But the ethereal beauty of the image notwithstanding, a life is about to end. This will be, and this has been, Barthes explains. I observe with horror an interior future of which death is the stake. In this photograph, then, Payne is already dead, and yet he is also going to die. The photograph contains both ideas. To provide a reader with a copy of the Payne portrait as part of the essay is to invite that reader to experience death in life. Even though the photo is from the middle of the 19th century, the young man's eyes and his face and hair are all arrestingly present. His clothes are dark and nondescript. They don't look antique, just plain, and he's leaning against a cold metal background, gazing straight ahead into the viewer's eyes. If it weren't for the manacles on his wrists, Payne could double as a model in a Calvin Klein ad. For Payne is that handsome and that young, and his gaze is so direct that it could easily be interpreted as flirtatious. But of course it's not. This is a man who is on death row. This is a man who would die in moments. So his look is probably resentful or resigned. For Barthes' purposes, the Payne portrait isn't just an illustration. The portrait has to be included in order for the reader to experience for himself what Barthes is describing. Looking at this photograph is a crucial part of the argument within the essay. Without the second sight that this picture provides, Barthes' points wouldn't be nearly as powerful. But as I said before, there are also essays in Camera Lucida in which Barthes refuses to give his readers a tangible photograph to guide our thinking. For instance, when he sifts through old photos of his mother after her death, pictures that show her as a young woman on a beach, Barthes says, I recognized her gait, her health, her glow, and yet none of these pictures seemed really right to him, neither as a photographic performance nor as a living resurrection of the beloved face. Wondering why these pictures of his dead mother don't speak more personally to him, Barth comes to the conclusion that history, with a capital H, separates him from these photographs. He asks, is history not simply that time when we were not born? In this moment, Barth emphatically does not give his reader any of the photographs he's discussing. Instead, he describes some of them, often in precise detail. Here, around 1913, is my mother dressed up, hat with a feather, gloves, delicate linen at the wrists and throat, her chic belied by the sweetness and simplicity of her expression. So what does this choice mean, this choice to withhold the photographs? I think that Barth is unable to locate his mother, the woman he knew, because he has never seen any of these accessories or clothing in his own life, his own world. Because Barth himself cannot engage second sight here, he doesn't recognize what he sees, and so what's represented in the physical image can't offer him the possibility of insight or meaning. So he refuses to let the reader see the picture, and this refusal allows the function of his essay, its purpose, to follow his form. The very heart of Camera Lucida is how Barth seeks his dead mother in old family photographs, arriving at a moment when he finally finds her in what he calls the Winter Garden picture. But that picture, too, is withheld from the reader. To try to keep the private and intimate connection between mother and son that the Winter Garden photograph holds for him, Barth feels obligated to recreate it in words rather than as an image. In Barth's logic, no stranger, meaning the reader, could ever fully understand a photograph of another stranger, in this case of his mother. And so since the reader cannot find or recognize the mother with any kind of intimacy or nuance, Barth refuses to reduce her down to the way that she's contained within a single photograph. In writing your own visual essays, you might take on Barth's second sight approach. If you're interested in this method, you'll want to make whatever pictures you include an essential part of your essay's purpose. The pictures should talk or speak every bit as much as the words do. I'll go so far as to say that the words and pictures should engage in a kind of conversation in your piece. You'll have to consider whether you wish to give the reader all of the images you're discussing, or whether you want to have absences that speak through strategic silence. This is Barth's methodology, and one that I would say is definitely worth trying. Now, two other excellent examples of second sight essays are by Nora Ephron, the screenwriter and director of When Harry Met Sally fame, and W.G. Sebald, an Eastern European writer known for his philosophic novels about World War II. In Ephron's essay entitled The Boston Photographs, she considers the ethics of reproducing three pictures that depict a failed rescue in 1975 of a young woman and her child from a burning building. The tragedy resulted in the woman's death and serious injuries to the child. It also inspired governmental officials across the nation to begin fixing decayed fire escapes in older urban areas. On the other hand, Sebald's book, A Place in the Country, is a series of interlinking essays that give critical and intimate portraits of 6 of the writer's artistic mentors. The book incorporates 40 illustrations that consist of photographs and photocopies, all of which are suggestive, but none of which is illustrative. To make meaning of Sebald's illustrations, the reader is obliged to consider the stories within the images against the stories he offers, to see where and how they cross-fertilize. And since each new reader interprets Sebald's pictures in new ways, his methodology takes us back to my opening discussion of Van Gogh's Starry Night. Sebald expects us to write the stories of his pictures through our own imaginations, our own desires and dreams. In a way, we become his collaborators, assisting him in providing a visual essay that works as a parallel and as a counterpoint to the written one. Okay, so now, I urge you to try your hand at creating your own visual essay. For all of us are visual thinkers. The images in our daily lives speak to us, from snapshots of family members to graphics on a favorite blog to a painting that hangs in our living room. They tell us stories of who we are and who we hope to be. It's not really a stretch to say that pictures think and talk. I challenge you to find your own great picture, one that talks to you. Then spend some time with it and see how it speaks to you of your past, your future, and your thoughts, and also of your own writing, especially your writing.